The night my son-in-law Bernard Calloway looked across the dinner table at me and said, "Connie, be serious. You're 63 years old." I felt something shift inside me. Not break. Shift. Like a gear catching after years of spinning loose. I'd just told them my plan. A real estate consulting business. Small, focused. Built on 31 years of managing my late husband's rental properties. Doing the books, handling the contractors, negotiating the leases while Raymond got the credit at the country club. I knew that world better than most people who called themselves professionals in it. My daughter Melissa Calloway set her fork down. She didn't say anything right away. She looked at Bernard the way wives do when they want their husbands to handle something they don't want to say themselves. Bernard smiled. The kind of smile that's meant to look patient. "Nobody's saying you're not smart, Connie. We're just saying this isn't the time to be taking something risky. You've got your health to think about. You've got the house." I said, "I've also got a mind." He laughed. Not loud, not cruel, just that little exhale through the nose that men do when they've already decided the conversation is over. Melissa reached over and put her hand on mine. "Mom, we just don't want to see you lose everything Dad left you." I drove home that night on the dark back roads between their subdivision and my house, and I thought about Raymond. About how I used to sit at the kitchen table at midnight going over receivables while he slept. How I'd call the plumber, the electrician, the property manager. How I'd renegotiated the lease on the Whitmore Street duplex 3 times over 15 years and never once been in the room when Raymond shook hands with the tenant. How his name was the only one on the business cards. I thought about that exhale through Bernard's nose, and I thought, I am going to build something that cannot be argued with. I should tell you a little about where I was in life before that dinner. My name is Connie Aldridge. I turned 63 that April, 6 months after Raymond passed from a stroke that came fast and left no time for goodbyes. We'd been married 38 years. Good years, mostly. Raymond was not a cruel man. I want to be clear about that. He was a man of his generation, which meant he believed in certain arrangements without ever examining them. He worked. I managed. He was the face. I was the infrastructure. It was the deal we made, even if we'd never spoken it aloud. After he died, I inherited the properties. 4 rentals, 1 commercial space on Hargrove Avenue, and the house we'd lived in for 22 years. I also inherited the assumption, from everyone around me, that I would find a property manager, let someone else handle it, and focus on my garden and my grandchildren. Melissa and Bernard lived 20 minutes away with their 2 kids. My son Patrick lived in Denver with his wife, Gwen, and checked in by phone every Sunday, dutiful as a church bell. Neither of them had ever once asked me what I'd spent the last 3 decades actually doing. I'd met a woman named Sandra Okonkwo at a real estate investors meetup in town. I'd been going for years, always as Raymond's wife, always the one who remembered the names and the numbers while Raymond worked the room. Sandra had started her own consulting firm at 56, helping small landlords navigate the rental market, evaluate acquisitions, renegotiate commercial leases. She was sharp and direct, and she saw something in me the first time we actually talked, which was 3 months after Raymond's funeral when I went back to those meetups alone for the first time. "You know more than half the people in this room," she said. "You just never got paid for it." That sentence lived in me for weeks. By the time I sat down at Melissa and Bernard's dinner table with my plan, I'd already spent 4 months preparing. I had a business structure outlined. I had a name, Aldridge Property Consulting. I had my first 2 prospective clients, former contacts of Raymond's who'd called me, actually, when they heard he'd passed, because they knew I was the one who'd always understood the details of our dealings. I hadn't expected the laugh. Foolish of me, probably. But I hadn't. The first few months were harder than I'd expected, and I'd expected hard. My prospective clients, Gordon Tate and his business partner, a man named Earl Pressfield, were polite but slow. They were used to dealing with Raymond. They weren't sure what to make of me across a table without him. I had to earn the room twice, once as a consultant, once as a woman who was not going to defer or disappear. I worked out of my kitchen at first, then converted Raymond's old study into a proper office. I set up systems I'd been running in my head for years. I hired a part-time assistant, a young woman named Deja, who was 26 and sharper than a tack and didn't require me to explain why I knew what I knew. Deja became the person who said, without blinking, "Connie, you're sitting on 30 years of market knowledge. Stop apologizing for it and how you present yourself." She redesigned my business cards. She built me a website. She taught me things I didn't know and never once made me feel old for not knowing them. What she couldn't do was fix what was happening with Melissa. My daughter called every week, and every week the call had a shape to it. She'd ask how I was. I'd say fine. She'd ask about the grandchildren. I'd say I'd love to see them. Then she'd ask, carefully, how the business thing was going. She always called it that, the business thing. And I'd tell her, and she'd say something that sounded supportive but wasn't, and we'd hang up, and I'd sit with the phone in my hand, feeling the distance between us like a weather system. Bernard, I later learned, had been making calls. I found out by accident. Gordon Tate mentioned, over coffee, that he'd received a call from Connie's son-in-law, who'd wanted to talk about my qualifications. Gordon was bemused more than anything. He'd already decided to work with me, and Bernard's call had struck him as odd. "He seemed to want me to know you were new to this," Gordon said. "I told him you'd been doing this work for 3 decades. He seemed surprised." I sat in Gordon's office and I kept my face perfectly still. I drove home and I did not call Melissa. I needed to think first. What I thought was, this is not the first time someone has worked against me quietly, assuming I wouldn't notice. And I thought, I have spent my entire adult life being graceful about it. I am going to choose this time to let it make me faster. The Hargrove Avenue commercial property changed everything. I'd been sitting on it since Raymond died. A 2-story mixed-use building, ground floor retail, office space above. The previous tenant had vacated. I'd been offered a quick sale price that was, frankly, insulting, and I'd declined it, which had surprised everyone, including my attorney. What I knew, and what I hadn't told anyone, was that the city's development corridor was shifting. I'd been watching it for 2 years. A rezoning vote was coming that would make that block significantly more valuable. I'd seen the signs because I'd been paying attention, the way I always paid attention, quietly, in the background, without anyone asking me to. I held the property. The rezoning passed in October. By November, I had 3 serious inquiries. By December, I had signed a 15-year commercial lease with a regional medical group for nearly double what the original quick sale offer had been. Sandra Okonkwo sent me a bottle of champagne. Deja framed the signed lease summary and put it on the wall of my office without asking. Melissa called to congratulate me, and her voice had something in it I hadn't heard before. Not quite discomfort, not quite respect, something in between that hadn't found its name yet. Bernard didn't call. The referrals started coming in spring. 2 of Gordon Tate's contacts reached out. Then a woman named Harriet Voss, who owned 6 rental properties in the county and had been mismanaging them for years without knowing it, and who sat across from me at our first meeting and said, "Someone told me you're the real deal." And I said, "Let me show you the numbers, and you can decide for yourself." By May, I had 7 active clients. By July 11, Deja hired her younger sister as a second assistant, and we turned the dining room into a second workspace. I thought about Raymond's voice sometimes, late at night, not with bitterness, just with a kind of clarity. He would have been proud, I thought. And then he would have offered to manage it for me. Some things you love and grieve at the same time. Patrick called from Denver one Sunday, and his voice was different, less careful. "Mom," he said, "Gwen and I looked up your company. You have actual reviews online." I said, "I do? 11 clients? As of last week, yes." A pause. "Mom, why didn't you tell us it was going this well?" I thought about that for a moment, because every time I tried, it became a conversation about whether I was sure. He was quiet for a long time. "That's fair," he said finally. "I'm sorry." Patrick was always the easier one to love, which meant he also got the benefit of less of my anger. He hadn't called Gordon Tate. He just worried in silence from Denver, which is its own kind of underestimation, but a gentler one. The difficulty with Melissa came to a head on a Tuesday in September. She'd come to my house to pick up some furniture, an armoire that had been her grandmother's, and she walked through the dining room that had become an office and stood there looking at the whiteboards and the filing system and the second monitor Deja had set up, and I could see her recalibrating something. "This is real," she said. "It was always real," I said. I kept my voice even. "You just didn't believe it." She turned around. Her eyes were a little wet and she was working hard not to let them be. Mom, I was scared. You were alone and you'd just lost Dad. And you wanted to start a business. I thought you were. You thought I was an old woman having a crisis. She didn't deny it. I sat down at my kitchen table and I asked her to sit across from me. And we had the conversation we'd been not having for 2 years. I told her what I knew. That I had run Raymond's property portfolio in every practical sense that mattered. That the knowledge I was selling as a consultant was knowledge I'd built over 30 years of invisible work. That when Bernard made that phone call to Gordon Tate, it hadn't just been an intrusion. It had been a signal to me that no one in my own family had ever looked at me and asked what I actually knew. Melissa cried. I didn't, though I'd done my crying about it long before, in the early mornings when the house was quiet. He thought he was protecting you, she said. About Bernard. I know that, I said. But it's possible to harm someone while protecting them, if you're protecting them from something they didn't ask to be protected from. She nodded slowly. She looked, in that moment, like the little girl she'd been before she learned to be careful around me. I didn't know, she said. I really didn't know what you'd been doing all those years. No, I said. You didn't. And that's something we should both think about. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with late recognition. I've thought about it a lot in the past year or so. Not the grief of being overlooked. That's an older grief, one I'd made a kind of peace with. But the grief of realizing how thoroughly invisible you can be to the people who love you. Melissa and I have been rebuilding, slowly and honestly. It is not fast work. Real reconciliation never is. But she has started asking me different questions when we talk. She asked me last month to explain how I'd known about the rezoning. She listened the whole time without once looking for the exit. Bernard is a harder project. He came to my house in October, which surprised me. He sat in my living room with the expression of a man who had practiced something and then arrived and found that the practiced thing wasn't quite right. He said he'd been thinking about the call he'd made to Gordon Tate. He said he wanted me to know that he understood, in retrospect, that it hadn't been his place. It wasn't an apology exactly. It was a man making his way toward one. I told him I appreciated him saying so. I meant it. Some bridges only need enough of a crossing to become usable. They don't need to be rebuilt from the foundation. What I didn't tell him was what I'd found out 2 months earlier, through Sandra, through channels I won't detail, that Bernard had approached one of my early prospective clients, a man named Terrell Hammond, who ultimately chose not to work with me, and had been part of the reason for that. Not maliciously, I believe, but clumsily, protectively. In the way that men sometimes dismantle things they're trying to save, I've decided to let that one go. Not because it doesn't matter, but because I have learned, at 64, that I have a finite amount of energy, and I am not going to spend it on a wound that has already healed around the edges. I will remember it, because I have earned the right to remember things clearly. Aldridge Property Consulting has 17 active clients now. We closed on an acquisition last month. I worked as the consulting advisor for a retired couple, the Vickers, who were buying their first investment property at 68 and 66 and were terrified and ready and wonderful to work with. When we finished signing, Dorothy Vickers squeezed my hand across the table and said, "We wouldn't have known how to do any of this without you." I thought about all the years of doing this without anyone knowing I was doing it. "You would have figured it out," I told her. "But I'm glad I could help you do it faster." Deeja has been with me for 2 years now. She is building something of her own. I can see it forming, and when she is ready to go, I will help her the way Sandra helped me, because that is how the thing actually moves forward. Not just one woman proving something in isolation, but the passing of what you know to the next person who needs it. Sandra and I have lunch every few weeks. She told me recently that the first time she saw me at those meetups, standing next to Raymond, she'd watched my eyes during conversations and noticed that I was the one tracking the numbers, the names, the follow-up items. "I always wondered," she said, "what you'd do if someone's just handed you the room." I told her, "No one handed it to me." She smiled. "I know. That's why it means more. My granddaughter is 11. Her name is Caitlin, and she is fierce and funny, and she came to my office last summer while Melissa brought her over to help with a small painting project I had going. and she walked through the workspace with the unhurried attention of someone who is absorbing something important without knowing quite what it is yet. She looked at the framed lease on the wall. She looked at the whiteboards. She looked at me. "Grandma," she said, "do you own a company?" "I do," I said. She thought about this. "Did you always?" "No," I said. "I started it a couple of years ago." "Why then?" I looked at her for a moment, waiting for an honest answer the way children do when they haven't yet learned to expect adults to soften things. "Because," I said, "I got tired of knowing things and letting them only count for other people." She nodded like that made perfect sense, because to her, it did. She's going to be something, that girl. She already is, and so, it turns out, am I. Late. Yes, later than I would have chosen if someone had asked me. But I was not waiting all those years, I was accumulating. There is a difference, a long, important, invisible difference that I am no longer willing to let anyone else define. The dinner table is still there, at Melissa and Bernard's house. I go for Sunday meals sometimes now. Bernard grills. The grandchildren run through the yard. Melissa sets out the good placemats. Nobody laughs anymore when I talk about what I'm working on, and I sit at that table in the long blue light of a Sunday evening, and I hold everything I know like a hand of cards I have finally been allowed to play, and I think, here I am, right on time.